You come here with fear clinging to you like a shadow that will not leave, and you have learned to call that shadow wisdom, or caution, or realism, but it is fear all the same. It tightens your chest, clouds your thinking, and whispers lies about who you are and where you stand. It tells you that you are alone, that heaven is silent, that your weakness has finally disqualified you. And I want you to hear this plainly. Fear has become far too comfortable in your life, and you have allowed it to speak with an authority it does not possess. You tremble before circumstances, before people, before your own thoughts, and yet you rarely tremble before God. That is the great imbalance of your soul. You say you are afraid because you are weak, because the road is uncertain, because the night feels long. But the real reason fear rules you is not the size of your problems. It is the smallness of your view of God. When God is reduced to a distant idea, a theological concept, or a last resort, fear naturally rises to take his place. You were created to live under the weight of glory, not under the weight of anxiety. When the soul loses sight of the living God, it does not become neutral, it becomes afraid. There is no vacuum in the heart. Something will rule you, and if it is not God, it will be fear. You say, I am alone. You repeat it so often that it feels like a fact rather than a feeling. But feelings are terrible masters and unreliable guides. They change with the wind, with sleep, with disappointment, with success. Truth does not bend to your emotions. The truth is that the God who made the heavens and stretched out the earth does not abandon his people. He is not like a man who promises with enthusiasm and forgets with ease. He does not make vows in moments of passion and then retreat in moments of cost. When he says he is with you, he means it in a way that shatters your small definitions of presence. God's presence is not merely that he is aware of you. He is not a distant observer watching history unfold like a spectator in the stands. His presence is active, deliberate, purposeful. He upholds your next breath even while you doubt him. He sustains your life even while you question his goodness. You wake up in the morning because he wills it, not because you deserve it. The ground beneath your feet holds because he commands it to hold. And this God, this holy and sovereign God, says to trembling people, do not fear. Not because they are strong, but because he is near. You have misunderstood what it means for God to be with you. You imagine it means a life without pain, without uncertainty, without loss. And when pain comes, you conclude that God must have left. But God was with his servants in prisons, in deserts, in storms, and even in death. His presence is not proven by comfort, but by faithfulness. He does not promise to remove every trial. He promises to sustain you in the midst of them. He does not promise a smooth road. He promises that the road will not be walked alone. Look at your fear for what it truly is. It is not humility. It is not prudence. It is often a subtle form of pride. You are convinced that everything depends on you, on your strength, your planning, your control. And when you realize you cannot control the outcome, you panic. Fear says, if I fail, everything collapses. Faith says, if I fail, God remains. One posture is centered on self, the other is centered on God. You must decide which one will define you. God's nearness does not mean he exists to serve your dreams. He is not your assistant, your safety net, or your emotional support concept. He is Lord, and it is precisely because he is Lord that you do not need to fear. If he were merely kind but not sovereign, you would have reason to tremble. If he were powerful but not good, you would have reason to despair. But he is both infinitely powerful and perfectly good, and he does not fluctuate between moods. His character is not shaped by your circumstances. You are not alone, even when obedience costs you relationships, even when faith isolates you, even when standing for truth makes you misunderstood. Loneliness is not proof of abandonment. Many of the most faithful moments in history were lived out in apparent isolation. The presence of God is often most profound when human support is stripped away, because then you are forced to ask what truly sustains you. If your faith only survives when others applaud it, it is not faith in God, but dependence on approval. There are moments when God allows you to feel your weakness so deeply that every false source of confidence collapses. He does this not to destroy you, but to teach you that His strength is not an abstract idea. It is a living reality. When you can no longer lean on yourself, you discover what it means to lean on Him. Fear screams that you will fall. God whispers that He will hold. The question is not whether fear will speak. It always does. The question is whose voice you will obey. You fear the future because you want to see it before you walk into it. But faith has never been about seeing the entire path. It has always been about trusting the one who leads. God rarely gives explanations that satisfy your curiosity. He gives promises that demand your trust. You want clarity. He wants faithfulness. You want guarantees. He wants surrender. And in that surrender, you find a peace that fear cannot counterfeit. Do not insult the faithfulness of God by measuring it against a single chapter of your life. You are quick to interpret suffering as absence, delay as denial, and silence as indifference. But God's work in you is deeper than your comfort and longer than your timeline. He is shaping you for eternity, not merely managing your present discomfort. The absence of immediate relief does not mean the absence of divine care. You say you are afraid because you have failed before. You remember your past sins, your broken promises, your half-hearted obedience. Fear tells you that God is tired of you, that patience has finally run out. But if God's commitment to you depended on your consistency, you would have been abandoned long ago. His faithfulness flows from His nature, not from your performance. This does not excuse sin. It magnifies grace. The God who calls you to holiness is the same God who walks with you patiently as He forms it in you. There is a kind of fear that is holy, a trembling before the majesty of God that leads to wisdom and obedience. But the fear that paralyzes you, that suffocates joy, that robs you of courage, does not come from Him. God does not command you to be fearless because danger is imaginary. He commands you because His presence is real. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is obedience in the presence of it. When God says He is with you, He does not mean that you will always feel Him. Feelings are fickle. There will be days when prayer feels heavy, when Scripture feels dry, when worship feels like labor. On those days, fear will tell you that God has withdrawn. But God's presence is not validated by your emotional state. He is with you because He has declared it so, and His word does not return empty. You are not alone in the battle against your own heart. God knows your thoughts before you speak them, your doubts before you confess them. He is not shocked by your weakness. He is not surprised by your struggle. What dishonors Him is not that you are weak, but that you refuse to trust Him with your weakness. He invites you not to pretend strength, but to depend on His. Fear wants you to live cautiously, quietly, safely. God calls you to live faithfully, boldly, obediently. These two paths cannot be walked at the same time. If you are determined to protect yourself at all costs, you will never experience the fullness of what it means to trust God. Faith often requires stepping forward while your knees are shaking, not waiting until they stop. You are not alone because God has bound Himself to His people in a way that surpasses human loyalty. He does not simply walk beside you, He works within you. He shapes your desires, convicts your conscience, strengthens your resolve. even when you feel confused, even when your prayers feel weak. His Spirit intercedes with purpose and power beyond your understanding. Do not measure God's nearness by the absence of storms, but by the assurance that you are not consumed by them. Many have walked through fire and emerged refined, not because they were strong, but because God was present. Many have stood firm under pressure, not because they understood everything, but because they trusted the one who did. Your story is not unique in its fear, but it can be profound in its faith. You fear being forgotten, overlooked, insignificant. But the God who numbers the stars also knows your name, not in a generic sense, but personally, intentionally. He is not distracted by the scale of the universe. His greatness does not diminish his care, it magnifies it. If he were smaller, he might overlook you. Because he is infinite, he does not. When you walk in obedience, you are never walking into emptiness. You are walking into the will of God, and that is the safest place to be, even when it feels dangerous. Fear evaluates risk without reference to God. Faith evaluates everything in light of who he is. One asks, "What if I lose?" The other asks, "What if God is glorified?" You are not alone when you stand against sin, when you refuse compromise, when you choose truth over comfort. Heaven stands with those who honor God, even when the world mocks them. Fear tells you that obedience will cost too much. Faith tells you that disobedience costs more. God's presence does not eliminate responsibility, it empowers it. Because he is with you, you are called to act, to speak, to endure. His nearness is not an excuse for passivity, but a foundation for courage. You are not waiting for God to show up. He is calling you to move forward in trust. Fear thrives in isolation, but truth exposes it. Remind your soul of who God is, not who fear says you are. Preach to yourself when your thoughts become hostile territory. Declare the character of God when circumstances attempt to rewrite it. You are not alone in that struggle. God himself is the anchor of your mind. There will be moments when obedience feels like walking into darkness, but it is never darkness to God. He sees the end from the beginning. He is not reacting to events. He is reigning over them. The path may be hidden from you, but it is clear to him, and that is enough. You must decide whether you will live as though God's presence is a theory or a reality. A theory comforts in conversation, a reality sustains in crisis. If God is truly with you, then fear no longer has the final word. It may speak loudly, but it does not speak truth. You are not alone when you are exhausted, when you are weary from doing what is right. God does not despise your weariness. He meets you in it. He gives strength, not as a reward for self-sufficiency, but as a gift to those who acknowledge their need. Do not wait for fear to disappear before you obey. It may never fully leave in this life, but obedience weakens fear's grip, and trust starves it of power. Each step taken in faith is a declaration that God is with you, that his promises outweigh your doubts. You stand where you are because God has allowed it, and you will go where you are going because God will lead you. You are not drifting through a meaningless story. You are held in the hand of a purposeful God who does not abandon his work halfway through. Fear says you are alone. God says he is with you, and one of those voices has never lied. Fear takes control of the heart when God is reduced, not denied outright, but diminished in practical reality. Most people who live in fear do not claim that God does not exist. They simply live as though he is distant, passive, or conditional. They believe in God with their mouths while functionally trusting their own understanding, strength, and control. And when those fragile supports begin to crack, Fear rushes in like a flood. Fear is not merely an emotion. It is a declaration about who you believe is truly governing your life. When God is small in your thoughts, circumstances become large, people become powerful, and uncertainty becomes unbearable. A reduced view of God does not happen overnight. It happens slowly, quietly, through neglect rather than rebellion. Prayer becomes occasional instead of desperate. Scripture becomes familiar instead of authoritative. Obedience becomes selective instead of wholehearted. And as God is pushed further to the edges of daily life, fear steps into the center. You begin to interpret everything through the lens of risk and loss rather than trust and faithfulness. You ask, "What if this goes wrong?" instead of, "Who is God in this?" That question alone reveals who you believe is most decisive in the outcome. Fear thrives where God's character is forgotten. When His sovereignty is treated as a doctrine rather than a reality, the heart is left vulnerable. You may say God is in control, but if every unexpected turn produces panic, your soul has not truly rested in that truth. If God is truly sovereign, then nothing arrives without permission, nothing remains without purpose, and nothing leaves without design. Fear argues that chaos reigns, that events are random, that you are one mistake away from collapse. Faith answers that God reigns, even when the reasons are hidden and the outcomes unclear. Courage does not come from pretending that trials are easy or danger is imaginary. Courage is born when the soul becomes convinced that God is present and faithful in the midst of what is hard and frightening. Not after the storm passes, not once clarity arrives, but in the storm itself. Many people wait for fear to leave before they move forward, but fear often leaves only after obedience begins. Courage grows when you act on what you know about God, rather than what you feel about your situation. The idea that God's presence guarantees comfort has weakened many hearts. When pain comes, they assume something has gone wrong, either with God or with themselves. But God has never promised a life free from difficulty. He has promised a life sustained by His presence. He does not remove every trial because trials are often the very tools He uses to deepen faith, expose false confidence, and teach dependence. A faith that survives only in ease is not faith, it is convenience. God's faithfulness is not proven by how quickly He delivers, but by how consistently He sustains. He is present not merely as a rescuer, but as a keeper. He holds the heart steady when emotions surge. He anchors the mind when thoughts scatter. He strengthens resolve when weariness sets in. Often the greatest evidence of His presence is not the absence of struggle, but the refusal of the soul to collapse under it. You endure not because you are resilient, but because God is faithful. Fear tells you that you must understand everything before you can trust. God calls you to trust Him even when understanding is withheld. If God explained every step, faith would be unnecessary. Trust is formed in the space between promise and fulfillment, where God asks you to rely not on sight, but on His word. Fear demands control, faith surrenders it, and that surrender is not passive. It is active reliance on the character of God. When God is reduced, responsibility feels crushing because everything seems to rest on your shoulders. Decisions feel paralyzing because failure appears final. But when God is rightly seen, responsibility is still real, yet no longer unbearable. You act faithfully, knowing outcomes are not ultimately yours to control. You plan diligently, yet trust deeply. You move forward without the illusion that perfection is required for God to work. God's presence does not mean He shields you from weakness. It means He meets you in it. Many people are afraid because they have finally encountered the limits of their own ability. They believed they were stronger, wiser, more capable than they truly were. When that illusion shatters, fear rushes in. But weakness is not a threat to God's work. It is often the doorway to it. God does not partner with self-sufficiency. He supplies strength where dependence is honest. Fear also grows when the heart forgets that God's faithfulness is rooted in His nature, not our performance. If His presence depended on our consistency, we would all be abandoned. But God is faithful because He is faithful, not because we are. This does not excuse disobedience. It humbles the heart and produces gratitude rather than fear. You obey not to secure God's presence, but because you already stand within it. Courage is sustained by remembrance. You must remind your soul who God has been, not just speculate about what He might do. Fear fixates on imagined futures. Faith recalls proven faithfulness. When you look back and see how God has carried you through things you once thought would destroy you, fear loses some of its authority. You begin to recognize its pattern, its exaggeration, its lies. The sustaining presence of God does not always feel powerful. Sometimes it feels quiet, almost hidden. There are seasons where faith is not marked by emotion, but by endurance. You keep going not because you feel strong, but because you are convinced that stopping would be disobedience. And in that steady obedience, God is present in ways that shape the soul more deeply than emotional highs ever could. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom. It tells you that caution is maturity, that hesitation is discernment, that retreat is humility. But wisdom that excludes trust in God is not wisdom at all. True wisdom begins with reverence, with a clear vision of who God is. When that vision fades, wisdom becomes fear dressed in respectable language. God's presence reframes suffering. It does not remove the pain, but it removes the meaninglessness. Suffering without God is crushing because it feels wasted. Suffering with God is still painful, but it is purposeful. You may not see the purpose immediately, but you trust that it exists because God is present and faithful. Fear says suffering proves abandonment. Faith says suffering may be the very place where God is most at work. When God is rightly exalted, fear is no longer the loudest voice in the room. It may still speak, but it does not command. The heart learns to question fear instead of obey it. Is this fear rooted in truth or in assumption? Is it magnifying the problem or minimizing God? These questions do not eliminate fear instantly, but they weaken its hold. Courage grows as trust is exercised. Just as fear strengthens when indulged, faith strengthens when practiced. Each act of obedience reinforces the truth that God is present and faithful. Each moment of reliance builds spiritual memory. Over time, the heart becomes less reactive, less shaken by uncertainty, because it has learned that God does not fail. God's sustaining presence is often most evident when outcomes are not what you hoped for, yet your faith remains intact. When disappointment does not destroy trust, when loss does not erase hope, when unanswered prayer does not silence worship, something profound has taken root. That endurance is not natural, it is the fruit of God's nearness. Reducing God leads to a life governed by anxiety. Knowing God leads to a life marked by courage, not because fear disappears, but because faith outweighs it. Courage is not loud confidence. It is quiet perseverance grounded in the conviction that God is with you, active, attentive, and faithful, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. As the soul learns to live in the reality of God's presence, fear loses its power to define decisions. You still feel uncertainty, but it no longer dictates obedience. You still recognize risk, but it no longer paralyzes action. God becomes the reference point, not the problem, not the obstacle, but the foundation beneath every step, every choice, every unknown moment, because God is present.